Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolong Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolong is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, a young woman goes missing after a night out on the town with her ex. 6 years later, Jermain Charlo's family is still wondering, where is she? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my Zungidee co-host, Alice.
Hi, Brett. I think we've just officially shifted to, any descriptor outside of the English language, because after 4 years, I think that's what happens. You run out of English words to describe me.
It's true. I mean, I really have. That was a rough take on Ojibwe that means brave. And we have Sophie to thank for that. So, and you are brave, Alice. I think that's a good description of you.
Not when it comes to spiders and cockroaches and snakes, but
Well, that's a different kind of bravery, right? Sometimes you just have to know. You have knowing what you're afraid of is a form of bravery in of itself. So that's what we'll say.
Said every not brave person.
Yes, well, that's true. That's true.
Well, actually, speaking of bravery, I do think this is really important because, we have covered a number of missing and murdered Indigenous women cases, and there are not enough episodes to give the amount of airtime these cases deserve. And we've told you this in past cases where part of the problem with covering these cases is that there's so little information about them, whether it's because they don't get a lot of investigation or that they just don't get kind of the media attention that other cases may get. And so there are people and podcasts and organizations that have cropped up over the years specifically to speak out on MMIW, missing and murdered Indigenous women. And they are really incredibly brave because a lot of these people who cover these cases lived those lives on these reservations themselves, and to speak out is a form of bravery in itself. So not to make light of bravery, but when I think about people who are doing that type of reporting, I'm anything but brave next to them.
And one podcast we have to mention is the Stolen podcast, which covered this case in depth and has covered a number of other cases of a similar nature. Very good podcast. You should check it out. It's really enjoyable. We listened to this podcast in sort of preparation for this. And Jermaine's case is one like so many that I think shines a light not only on her individual case, but also the greater problem. When you listen to these cases, we talk about this, you can wax poetic about true crime all day long. And we talk about sometimes, what's the point? Why do we do this? Yes, it's entertainment, but what else? And obviously, focusing on the victims is always important. But when you listen to stories like this, you also learn about other bigger problems that are pervasive in a lot of areas. And I think it's worth shining a light on that. Stolen does a really good job of that and sort of uses Jermain's story to speak to a bigger issue. So I hope you guys will listen to that podcast. Look, I know some of y'all don't like it when we cover the cases that don't have a lot of information, but we think it's important to cover these cases because there's a reason they don't have much information, because not many people cover them, and it can be a vicious cycle. Nobody covers it, so nobody talks about it. So there's not a lot of information. And we think getting these stories out is important. And look, they're mysteries just like the other ones, and they have answers, and somebody out there has those answers. And we're going to keep covering these whenever we can because we think it's important, and we think these are cases that more people need to know about.
Indeed. So with that, and those of you who are listening live, already we're seeing a lot of people say you haven't heard of this case. And so I'm doubly glad that we're getting to cover it today. So let's dive in to who we are talking about today. And that's Jermain Charlo, who was only 23 years old when she disappeared without a trace on June 16th, 2018 from Missoula, Montana. So one thing to note here, so this one's in the United States. We've covered a couple of MMIW cases in Canada. So not only is this in the United States, but it's a really recent case. She disappeared almost 6 years ago to the day. And these cases are so difficult when you have someone who really just disappears seemingly into thin air. But hopefully as we go through the timeline, we can glean some information and try to reach some answers, because 6 years is too long for her children. She has 2 sons and her family not to know what happened to her. Now, as we've mentioned, Jermain is an Indigenous woman who is a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. She was born in Dixon, Montana, which is a small community within the Flathead Indian Reservation, where she lived up until the time of her disappearance. Jermain has 2 sons, Thomas and Jake, and they were very, very young when their mother disappeared. Thomas was not even 4 years old yet, and Jake was 2.5 years old. And you can see pictures of Jermain on our YouTube page or on our website, and you can see for yourself that she's been described as very beautiful, highly social, loved people, an outdoorsy type whose main priority was being a good mom to her boys. Jermain seemingly up and vanished after leaving the Badlander, which is a bar in downtown Missoula. She had been at that bar and a couple other bars that night with her ex-boyfriend, who was also the father of her children, Michael DeFrance. And she was last seen in the early morning hours of June 16th, 2018. Nearly 6 years later, Jermain's family is seemingly no closer to getting any answers about her strange disappearance. Now, Jermain's story is a sad one, but unfortunately not an uncommon one for Indigenous women in America. In 2015, the National Congress of American Indians found that an estimated 40% of women who are victims of sex trafficking identify as American Indian, Alaska Native, or First Nations. Additionally, a 2016 study by Urban Indian Health Institute found that the murder rate for women living on reservations is 10 times higher than the national average, and that murder is the 3rd leading cause of death for Native women. These are staggering statistics, is a reality for Native women living in the United States, and Jermain's story is but one of them.
And we've discussed the reasons for this, and we won't dwell on them, but the interaction of different police authorities, tribal police, state police, federal authorities, different laws, the way they interact, the fact that so many problems that are endemic to the reservations, poverty, drug abuse, alcoholism, sort of generational trauma that includes a lot of domestic violence. This all combines to cause this, and there are a lot of people who are working very hard to make the situation better, but it's obviously a big problem, and it's one that doesn't get a lot of attention and doesn't get a lot of resources, and it perpetuates from generation to generation, and Jermain was part of that. We're going to talk about her relationship with her boyfriend. It wasn't the first time she was in a violent relationship, because her father was also violent with her mother, and so I think her aunt was in a relationship with a lot of domestic violence. Domestic violence was something that plagued the area, and it plagued Jermain's life. And you're going to see that as we begin to walk through the history leading up to her disappearance. So let's start with her relationship with Michael DeFrance, because it's hard to talk about this case and not talk about their relationship. So Jermain and Michael DeFrance, they had a very tumultuous relationship with documented incidents of domestic abuse on the part of Michael DeFrance. The exact timeline of their relationship is difficult to confirm, but Michael's mother recalls them dating on and off for about 8 years. On April 13th, 2013, Jermain and Michael got in an argument at their home in Dixon, Montana. Michael is the father of Jermain's children, and they're living together. According to police, Jermain told the police that DeFrance held her down across the hood of a van, hit her 4 times in the face and head, threw her on the ground, and spat on her. Michael, I think, said he only hit her once, as if that, makes it better. Michael would plead guilty to the charges of partner or family member assault, PFMA, which is the statute in Montana. Montana actually has some pretty good domestic violence laws. We'll talk about those more as we go on. He's ordered to pay a fine, spend a day in jail, forfeit firearms for a year, and complete 40 hours of domestic violence treatment. This was in 2013. It is likely that in 2011, he also had a similar charge against him, though it's a little unclear. His record is sealed. He would have been a minor at the time, so that's probably why, but pretty good argument that this was not the first time he did this. At the time of this incident, Jermain is only 17.
This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Wondery.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
And this is, something helpful to bring up here. So Jermain was drawn to Michael for a lot of reasons, as we all are as teenage girls. But one thing that she lacked was a stable home. She, had a mother and a father, but I think her father, self-professed, was really not in her life because her parents were very young. They were teen parents. I think her mom was only 15 when she was born. And she did have grandparents and great-grandparents around who I think served as a huge stabilizer in her life. But because of her family situation, she kind of bounced around multiple family members' homes. And this is worth mentioning because a lot of women who are vulnerable across the board, whether Indigenous or not, have these kind of family situations that make them vulnerable. She didn't really have a father in her life, and she didn't have really even a stable mother figure at the time. Her mom had to go work, I think, was out of town sometimes, whereas Michael had a mother and a father and siblings who all lived under one roof. And I think that likely had something to do with the attraction to him as well. It was something that she lacked in her own life that she was seeking to fill.
In the summer of 2014, they're still together. At this point, Jermain is pregnant. In fact, she's 8.5 months pregnant. So she's about to have the baby. And when you know it, Michael DeFrance is arrested again after a fight with Jermain. In this fight, Jermain's aunt actually intervenes because, once again, Jermain is 8.5 months pregnant. And DeFrance throws her onto the ground. He is arrested but it doesn't appear that any charges are pressed against him for this event. And this is not unusual in domestic violence situations. Usually, for every conviction in a domestic violence situation, you're going to have multiple arrests that never lead to charges or never lead to convictions. A lot of times, the reason for that is fairly simple. The victim doesn't want to testify. They don't want the person to be charged. And we've said this before, it's a myth. The whole pressing charges thing is a myth. You can prosecute someone whether the victim wants to press charges or not. But practically speaking, if the person who is the subject of the attack is not willing to testify about the attack, it's impossible to continue with that case.
You can imagine why that is. If you don't have the person who was there and who suffered kind of the abuses of the perpetrator describing and testifying under oath what happened, what you're left with is likely very little evidence, right? Usually other people are not around, but then it becomes a he said, she said, except she's not saying anything because she's not testifying. And usually these abuses, no matter how violent they are, they're difficult to capture as evidence in pictures. Bruises take days to develop. You can hit someone very hard and do immense emotional, even physical damage, but it may not show up in a picture, right? We've seen this a lot where we've heard of just, horrific beatings, and the pictures don't quite match what we know happened to the person because, again, welts take some time to develop, but when you call the police, you take the pictures right away. And of course, by the time a case goes to trial or goes before a jury or a judge, those scars or those wounds likely have already healed. So it's not like you're showing up with a freshly beat up face to be able to show the jury what happened. And again, the person with the freshly beat up face is not showing up in these instances.
And, we talk about strangulation sometimes in reference to other cases. And one thing that's interesting about strangulation, oftentimes you will have bruising, but a lot of times you don't. And this goes, I just go back to this. Whenever you hear a case and anybody tries to put definitive weight on something that you do or do not see, and the whole case turns on that. One problem with that is the body's weird and everybody is different. All that we talked about, the various rigor mortis and liver mortis and all that stuff, and people want to put so much weight on that, and it's so hard because everybody's different. Strangulation, a lot of times, you'll have pretty severe damage internally. So usually, strangulation, if you die, they're going to be able to figure it out, because even if there's not external signs of it, you're going to see internal stuff, whether it's broken hyoid bones or just all sorts of damage to the muscles. And one thing I'll say about strangulation, I bring this up because strangulation is something that often happens in domestic violence and is alleged in some of what's going on here. The one thing I want to say about strangulation, I've said this before, but I can't say it enough because I just want people to know this. If someone strangles you, the chances they're going to kill you one day increase massively. I mean, frankly, I think if someone strangles you, your assumption should be, given a long enough timeline, they will eventually murder you. And we've seen that a lot. There is incredibly strong correlation between strangulation and domestic partner murder. So I just always want to say that because I know there are people out there that are in relationships where stuff like that's happening. And just know that that is an incredibly dangerous situation. And as we're going to see in this case, getting out of those relationships is so hard. It's like a spider web. You're trapped in so many ways. Just take this case. Jermain's in a situation where she's 8.5 months pregnant. What is she supposed to do? She doesn't have a lot of resources. She's got a baby that's about to be born. She needs Michael in her life. So I think that probably has something to do with the fact that we don't see these charges pressed. Anyway, that's an aside, but I think an important one.
And that's, we talk a lot about personal crimes, and strangulation is one of the most personal ways you can kill someone. We've also said stabbing too, because there's a level of being close to a person and having to physically touch them. Strangulation, oh my goodness, because when the physicality of strangling someone is you are incredibly close to them and you're incredibly close to their face, which is showing all of the pain and all of the suffering that you are imposing on them. And in seeing that, and you continue to do it, that level of suspending any care for the other person, I think, is what leads to that correlation of murder down the road, right? So they've studied these, there's statistics behind it, but when you think about the psychology of it, there are things there, right? Like think about a toddler or a child who doesn't know the results of their actions. Once they see someone react to what they're doing, if they truly did not mean to hurt someone, they immediately stop. That's the opposite in a strangulation case. Usually, most of the time, you're not strangling someone from the back because your thumbs, opposable thumbs, are the strength of your strangulation. You're going for the hyoid bone, which is right below your chin. You're not strangling someone from the spine, from the C7. That's plenty of protection for your neck. Of course, you can strangle someone from the back, but typically these types of cases, you're facing them, looking straight into their faces, seeing the evil you're doing to them, and continuing and having no regard for them. That level of anger and disregard for the other person, I think you can begin to imagine why you can see murder down the road.
So July 11th, Jermain gives birth to the couple's first child together. That's 2014. So by November of 2014, Jermain is calling the police again. This time she's reporting an argument between her and Michael. She claims that Michael took her phone, dropped it in water, and broke it. The responding officer says this is a civil issue, not a criminal issue, and nothing further was done. Not really right about that for a couple different reasons, not the least of which in a lot of states, if you destroy someone's phone to prevent them from calling the police to report the fact that you're abusing them, that in of itself is a crime. That's 2014. Another year passes. In December of 2015, Jermain has given birth to the couple's second child together.
So now you're beginning to see, over the course of just a couple of years, seemingly prolonged abuse, if not escalating, and even more intertwined lives between Jermain and Michael because of the birth of additional children. And you heard earlier that Jermain loved her children. May 15th, 2017, Jermain makes a Facebook post about DeFrance's abuse. Now, the Stolen podcast reports that it said, quote, people think it's fun to be in an abusive relationship. Well, it's not. Michael DeFrance has hurt me to the point where now he's threatening me to be with him to make things right or I lose my kids. My kids are my all and my heart. This morning, because I refused a kiss and just wanted a ride to work, he decided to leave. I gave him his things. Yes, I did push him out of the door so I could lock it, but he had no reason to put his hands on me. So this is a public post, and shortly after this, Jermain and Michael broke up. But even though they broke up, they've been together, 8 years? They lived down the street from each other. They have 2 children together. Those are really difficult lives to unintertwine from each other. And we see that. Just about 2 weeks later, despite breaking up, or less than 2 weeks from breaking up on May 30th, 2017, Jermain and Michael attend a concert together in Bozeman, Montana, while still broken up. When they were driving home that night, it was around midnight, and you might think, okay, maybe they're broken up, so maybe Jermain has some leverage now, Michael will treat her better. Quite the opposite. During that drive, Michael, in his rage, was mad again at Jermain, and he actually pushes her out of a moving car, and she's left there. He doesn't turn around, he doesn't say, you've learned your lesson, get back in the car. He pushes her out of a moving car and drives off. And a police officer picked Jermain up. Now, Michael was again charged with partner or family member assault in that instance. And as serious as that sounds, pushing someone out of a moving vehicle and leaving them, for dead, for abandonment? She's far from home. She's not going to be able to walk home from Bozeman. Despite that, the charges against Michael would later be dismissed. Maybe it had something to do with Jermain not wanting charges pressed. We don't know. But he was not ever prosecuted or convicted for that charge. On July 29th, 2017, Jermain called the police on Michael again. So this is, just a couple months after they'd broken up. And she claimed that Michael had gotten handsy with her and she had kicked him out. This time, Michael took the kids with him because he knows that would hurt Jermain badly since she loved her boys. But the police said there was no custody order in place, and so there was nothing they could do about it. So that was the end of that conversation. So already you're beginning to see how difficult it is for Jermain to disentangle herself from Michael. She loves her children. There's no custody order in place. Law enforcement is telling her we can't do anything about it. But every time she essentially stands up for herself, even though they're broken up, he has the ultimate trump card. Her kids. He gets to take her kids from her, and they're small children. They're, 1 in 3, they can't really have agency or independence, to walk away from their dad, nor may they want to. These are very difficult situations for young children. And so he has a leash on her, despite them not being in a relationship.
Yeah, and look, I think there are those of you out there who are thinking, why doesn't she just leave him? Why does she stay in this situation? And it's just not that simple. It's never that simple. And it's never that simple for all sorts of reasons. And in this case, the added fact of the children and his willingness to use them as pawns in this game makes it even more difficult than it always is. All of the various connections that keep you with someone, even when you want to leave them, not the least of which is the most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship is when you leave. That is when things can go from really bad to murder. And a lot of women know that, and they fall into a trap where they're trying to keep the person happy to stay safe. And the only way to stay safe is to try and not make the person mad, and they're certainly not going to leave. So I understand that feeling. I really do. But I think when you think about this a little bit deeper, you start to see it's just not that simple. So fast forward to June 15th, 2018, about a year later. Now, at this point, and for a while, and this sort of goes to what I was just saying, they are broken up. Like, they're not together as a couple. In fact, Jermain is dating someone else at this point, but they are still involved in each other's lives. They have children together, and they still will spend time together. And on this night, they're going to do that. So on the evening leading up to Jermain's disappearance, Michael and Jermain, they begin a night out together at a bar called The Dark Horse in Missoula, Montana. The bartender that evening remembers seeing the two of them, and on the Stolen podcast, you actually hear him describe them as chatting on the end of the bar, sort of sitting on the end of the bar chatting, but they never have any physical contact. Neither of them appear particularly upset, but he did recall that Jermain spent most of her time on her phone and didn't seem all that interested in Michael. She seemed more interested in what was going on her phone than whatever Michael was doing. They didn't stay at the bar very long. Now, one thing that's interesting, Jermain and her phone usage was a issue for Michael. Remember, one of the events that led to calling the police was he destroyed one of her phones. And so it was known that that was something that would make him mad. And you have the situation where the bartender does not see him mad, but does see a situation where the two of them are together and she is spending more time on her phone than she is talking to him.
We have a lot of kind of points of reference because they're seen out in public, but then all of a sudden things drop off. So the next kind of period of time that we have is that night from 10 p.m. to 12 a.m. After leaving the Dark Horse, Jermain and Michael made their way to two other bars in Missoula, the Golden Rose and the Badlander. Both are in the same building, and there's security cameras outside that actually catch Jermain and Michael in an alleyway behind the Badlander. Lowell Hockelter, who works coordinating searches for the Lighthouse Group, has seen this footage, but it's actually under seal because it's an ongoing investigation, so I don't think it's available online anywhere to see. But Lowell, who did view this footage, noted that Jermain appeared to be happy. She didn't seem to be agitated in any way, but she was very social. She was floating easily between different groups and chatting with many people. She seemed very sure of herself, very confident. For example, when a group of people would leave to go back in the bar, she didn't stand around awkwardly by herself or follow them. She would just move seamlessly into another conversation group, and it seemed that she was well liked by everyone back there. She was just having a good time catching up with friends, is what it appeared. Now, this video is video only. There's no audio with it, so you don't get to hear what they're saying, but no one seems agitated. Just seems like a typical relaxed night out with friends. Now, Michael, on the other hand, who's also caught on this footage, he does not appear to have the same type of outgoing social demeanor as Jermain. Rather, he appears to hang back more. I think he's wearing a baseball cap, and he keeps to himself, and he doesn't talk very much. Seems like he's kind of just tagging along where Jermain is, and she's the one who is there to see people.
Jermain has her last communication with her current boyfriend, Jacob Love, via text message at 11:52 p.m. The two of them very recently started dating, as we said. He was out of town. He's 200 miles away on the evening that Jermain goes missing. But she was planning on staying at his house that night, which I think is an interesting point. So she's out with the father of her 2 kids. They're hanging out. She has no intention of going back home with him that night. She's fully intending to stay at Jacob's house.
And if you think about this, those of you who may be thinking, well, that's weird. If she's already dating someone and she's serious, or not, who knows how serious it is, but why would she be out with an ex? Think about it. She's only 23 years old. She's been with this guy for basically a decade. She grew up with him. I mean, they were children together. They had children as essentially children together. When you have someone who's been in your life for basically half of your entire life and they still live down the street and you share children together, your lives are just so intertwined. It doesn't surprise me at all that they are still on these terms where they can go out together, because he is so much a part of her life, kids or no kids. I mean, he is essentially her entire childhood.
Yeah, I mean, look, you can think this is weird if you want to, but I think Alice is right. I think this is just a very complicated situation, and people are complicated. They just are. Everyone is. We all have weird complications in our lives, and this was a complication for her. And she's, and once again, I think it's important to note what Alice said earlier. It's not like they're out on a date and she's like sitting in his lap and they're totally focused on each other. She's being a social butterfly. He's there, but he's just one of the people that she's seeing and hanging out with. We're focusing on him for a reason, as we're about to get to. So at around midnight, Jermain and Michael are caught on the same surveillance camera walking down the alley behind the Badlander and turning the corner out of frame. So on the footage, it appears that both of them are acting normally. The situation did not seem hostile, and Jermain did not appear to be intoxicated. So that's where they are around midnight of the night and going into the morning where Jermain's going to disappear.
Now that's the last verifiable sighting we have of Jermain. Oh, when you have these footages and you know, someone just turns the corner and you know what's going to happen next, which is that she's never going to be seen again. It's just so hard because you're like, what if this camera could just follow her a little bit longer to see where she goes? But like we said, she didn't leave after a fight. It wasn't a agitated situation. All night she's been kind of walking back and forth among people, and this is just another one of those walks. Except what happens next. So this is between 12 and 1 a.m. Michael DeFrance talks to the police, and he says that he dropped Jermain off by the Orange Street Food Farm in Missoula, Montana, somewhere between 12 and 1 a.m. This is really important because later on, when there is a search for Jermain, every news outlet, every missing poster says she was last seen at the Orange Street Food Farm. The only reason we know this is because of what Michael told police. So, this is a problem because Michael changes his story later. He reportedly tells 2 differing stories of where he dropped Jermain off that evening. So he told her family, because after, her family members couldn't get a hold of Jermain, they start calling around, and Michael's one of the first people they call because, well, she was with him that night. And because they are so close because of their children and their history, that he is a natural person for them to call. And he tells the family, oh, I dropped her off at the Orange Street Food Farm. And he told law enforcement later on, though, a different story than what he told the family. He told her he dropped Jermain off at an intersection, which was about 8 blocks from the food farm. So not exactly close. It should be noted that the food farm is pretty close to where she was planning to stay that night. So if you remove it by 8 blocks, not impossible to walk, but kind of a strange distance to ask to be dropped off if it's already 12 or 1 a.m. Law enforcement state that they have determined Jermain was dropped off at the intersection and not at the food farm. They don't go into why that is. Again, this is an open investigation, but I would imagine they probably looked at some cell phone pings, or they were able to verify, traffic stops, something like that. But they looked into those 2 stories and determined the more likely story was that Jermain was actually dropped off at the intersection. Now, Michael claims this is where Jermain wanted to be dropped off, at this intersection, and that he last saw her walking away into the darkness. After this point, Jermain was never seen or heard from again.
And there's a couple of points I think are worth fleshing out here. You may be wondering, why would he tell the family one thing and then turn around and tell the police something else? Well, it's because he didn't talk to them at the same time or near the same time. It's going to shock you to know that initially the police didn't do a whole lot in this case. I know that blows your mind and you've never seen that before, and that never happens in any of these cases. But in this case, it's going to take the police a while to take this seriously. It's going to take, I think, about 10 days before the officer, who has been very dedicated to uncovering what happened in this case, finally got on the case. But up until that point, there wasn't a whole lot. And the family in this lighthouse group, they're doing the search by themselves. So, of course, the first thing the family does is they call Michael and say, hey, have you seen Jermain? And he says, oh, yeah, I dropped her off at the food place. Now, then, 2 weeks later, he tells the police he drops her off at this intersection. I think it's important what Alice said. The more likely thing is the intersection. I think the reason for that, and we don't have specifics, but we know enough about what the police know that I think it is the cell phones. The cell phones were near the intersection, but they were never near the food market. Now, it would make sense for him to drop her off at the food market, at the food farm, because as Alice said, to our understanding, this is close to where she was going. So it would make sense for her to ask to be dropped off there. But it doesn't seem like she was. And although in isolation, if from the very beginning he had told the story of the intersection, it makes sense to some extent because, as I said, she was always planning on staying somewhere else. He was always going to drop her off somewhere. So it makes sense for him to have done it, but not there. And it certainly doesn't make sense for him to have changed the story. Now, look, it's possible he just, remembered later something he didn't remember the day after. That's not normally how memory works.
And one thing to note, so I don't think that this particular area is their neighborhood, right? Like, I don't think Michael knows this area very well. So why say the Orange Street Food Farm? Because that's really specific and something to come up with right away. Well, just as I have no inside knowledge of the investigative file here, but if he were talking to me or I'm hearing this after the fact, as the investigator, as the questioner, the first thing that pops in my mind is, oh, she told him to drop her off at the food farm. That's why it's in his mind, because the first thing he says is, oh, I did what she told me to do. The food farm, that's where I dropped her off. Otherwise, it would be a little confusing why you would insert an area that under any investigation would probably rule out that you actually did that. So again, I have no inside knowledge on that, but that would be my sense if I were listening to him tell two differing stories is, someone told you to drop them off at the food farm, and it was probably Jermain.
So from 2 a.m. to 10 a.m., we have cell phone records from Verizon that show cell tower pings that put Jermain's cell phone about 3.6 miles northeast of the Ivaro cell phone tower in this 8-hour period. This, it will probably surprise no one, is very close to Michael DeFrance's home. What also will probably surprise no one is they also pulled Michael DeFrance's cell phone records and his tower pings, and wouldn't you know it, his cell phone is in very close proximity to Jermain's cell phone. Now, Michael at some point is going to have to tell the police that he did, in fact, have Jermain's cell phone that evening after she left his vehicle. Presumably, his cover story here is she left it in the car. So, he did what any normal person would do if a friend of theirs left a cell phone in their car. He destroyed it and disposed of it. And police have never been able to recover the phone.
Brett, if you left your phone in my car, and let's say my fat bottom sat on it and I accidentally broke it, even if I broke it, I would bring it back to you and be like, dang it, I'm so sorry. I sat on your phone and I broke it because I know you have pictures on it. I know you have contacts on it. I know that even if it's broken, there's probably a SIM card in there and you could probably put that card into another phone and recover all of your data. I would not throw away your broken cell phone.
No, that seems like a little bit of a red flag there for Michael, that he not only had the phone, but he destroyed it. And when exactly did that happen? When did he? So, imagine his story, presumably, is they left on good terms. He dropped her off after a nice night out with the mother of his children. She walked off into the darkness. He finds her cell phone at some point, either that night or the next day. He hears from the family the next day asking where she is. At what point did he decide, you know what I need to do with this cell phone? Not turn it over to the police, not give it to the family. I'm going to destroy it and get rid of it.
Does this sound familiar by any chance? Maybe from another police report when he broke her cell phone on purpose? Likely from a heated discussion or a fight, and he dropped it in the water. I mean, it just sounds like this seems to be a thing he does, specifically to Jermain.
Right. So June 17th, Jermain's grandmother cannot get in contact with her, and she reaches out first to Jermain's boyfriend, Jacob, and he confirms that he hasn't had any contact with her either. Now, given this was very unlike Jermain, her grandmother reports her missing to tribal police on June 17th. Now, this is sort of a multi-jurisdictional issue, right? You have the tribal police. She lives on tribal land, but she didn't disappear on tribal land. She disappeared in Missoula. So the next day, June 18th, Jermain's family files missing person reports for Jermain with the Missoula City Police. But like everything else, the report is not actually filed until June 20th, which is 4 days after Jermain had last been seen.
So Jermain's grandmother does the right thing, right? I mean, she has a gut feeling. She talks to Jermain all the time. They're very close, and she doesn't hear from her. So she immediately reports her missing. We talked about these multi-jurisdictional issues before, and look, this is like the ultimate administrative red tape. It doesn't mean any of these jurisdictions can't, and oftentimes in these cases, they do work together, which is wonderful, but administratively, there's like file openings and file closings. And sometimes if you have the wrong person, they don't know how to open a file if it's not in their jurisdiction. And so it's quite literally red tape that prevents a lot of these files from being opened. And when you have reservation lands, which are their own jurisdiction, apart from federal or state localities, it gets very hairy, especially when you are going to bars that are outside of your reservation. You often go off your reservation to go do many things, as Jermain did that night. And because of that, that's part of what causes the delay in her actually being reported. So because they're not getting much help from police, on June 22nd, 2018, Jermain's mother, Jennifer, contacted the Lifeguard Group, which is a group working to end human trafficking. And you may be thinking, whoa, human trafficking, what are we talking about? All we know is Jermain disappeared. Human trafficking is a real problem, especially for Indigenous women, for any vulnerable woman. And Jermain was young. She was 23 years old. She was beautiful. You can imagine that she could very well be the target of a pimp who thinks they can make a lot of money off of her. This happens way more than you'd like to think. Unfortunately, both Brett and I have investigated and prosecuted a number of these cases. Oftentimes, these women can be the gamut, right? They can be young runaways. I would not call a 12 or 13-year-old runaway who has no other options consenting, but it's difficult when you're in those situations. They're vulnerable. They're picked up by an older pimp who says, I'm going to give you all the food and all the shelter and even money and dress you up real nice. You have nothing else in the world because you just ran away from even tougher situations. You're going to say yes, but is that consenting? No, that's human trafficking, especially because then you become indebted to that pimp until you stop making him money and then he throws you out or kills you. Second, women who are just kidnapped, snatched off the streets. Your, mothers may have scared you when you were younger. That does happen. It doesn't quite happen like so much as you may think, like a white van rolls by and they open a sliding door and they just grab a girl off the street. That can happen, but oftentimes they are canvassing a particular area, probably a low-income area, and they know and see the types of women who are unattached, like they're independent, maybe they don't have stable families who would know that they're missing, that they may have people around them who want to do them harm. Oftentimes, these women are sold into human trafficking by loved ones, family members, boyfriends, whatever. It happens. And so when you have something like this happen, even though we don't know for a fact that human trafficking may be something that happened to Jermain, it is absolutely statistically a possibility, which is why they reach out to the Lifeguard Group. And so 6 days after Jermain disappeared, this volunteer group canvassed the area of downtown Missoula. And you're not going to be surprised that after nearly a week, there's no signs of Jermain found. They ask people if they've seen her. Jermain is known in the area. She's very social. She's well-liked. People remember generally seeing her. But you're talking 6 whole days later, there's very little usable information that people have at that point.
So on June 27th, which is 10 days after Jermain is initially reported missing, the Missoula County Sheriff's Department applies for a search warrant for the DeFrance home, her personal property belonging to Jermain, including her cell phone. So they're starting to work this case. Now, we know about these search warrants because the county, for whatever reason, did not seal them. Oftentimes, search warrants are sealed. The city is also investigating Jermain's disappearance and, in fact, has the lead on the case. We know they issued search warrants, but we don't actually know what they say because they are not sealed. But we do know, in this case, that no items were seized during the search, that there were photos taken. As we said, one of the reasons the cell phone wasn't seized is because by this point it had been destroyed and disposed of. It's unfortunate that it took 10 days. Maybe if it had taken less time, the phone wouldn't have been destroyed, but that's where we're at. So this investigation begins to run long. We've already lost a lot of time. We're going to lose more. July 13th, 2018, so nearly a month later, the county is applying for a search warrant for Jermain's EBT records in order to look at her financial activity. Once again, would have been nice if they had done that a little bit earlier, but I know they don't have a ton of resources, and they're quickly running out of leads to the extent they even had any, other than the big one, Michael DeFrance.
And I'll say they didn't stop there. The Missoula County Sheriff's Department applies for yet another search warrant on August 1st, 2018. And this one is related to Michael DeFrance. This warrant is for his location history, his browsing history, search history from Google, which Google does provide. And this is when it's determined that Jermain and Michael's phones were in close proximity to each other between 2 and 10 a.m. the day that Jermain disappeared. So what is that? 2 months later is when we're figuring out that their phones are together during the times that no one sees her ever again. So the next day, on August 2nd, 2018, 1 day later, the Sheriff's Department applies for another search warrant, this time to search for the DeFrance's family property a second time. I'll say they are moving quickly. As soon as they find out this information, they're applying for the second search warrant. In the warrant, they ask for a 10-day surveillance of the DeFrance property, including infrared photography and drones. And the department wants to capture evidence of hidden buildings, bunkers, storage areas, and other areas of concealment. What you're hearing here is maybe a hostage situation, right? They're trying to use all of these seemingly very high-tech devices to see if there's any underground bunkers that she's being held. Their investigation is leading them to this particular search warrant. We've said that there has to be probable cause to support why you want to search for these things. But as you can probably tell, this is a pretty big search. It's not 1 day, it's 10 days. It's using infrared photography, drones, things that cost a lot of money. And it's not clear if this surveillance, even though the warrant was granted, it's not clear if the surveillance ever actually occurred because of how involved that is, this particular search is. They don't have to document what they have or have not done back to the court. You have to fill out like what you take, but we don't know if this surveillance happened as they described it to get permission for. That's a really important thing to know, by the way. The warrant just asks permission to do something. Then what you do with the warrant, that's kind of like your ticket to what you're able to do, but you have to stay within the parameters of what you've been given permission to do, but it's not an order for you to have to execute everything that you've listed out for permission in that warrant. So on the previous 3 warrants, unlawful restraint was listed as the reason for the warrant. So the reason was they thought that Jermain was being unlawfully restrained by Michael. But in this particular warrant for the search of the property, it now changes from unlawful restraint to deliberate homicide as the reason for the warrant. So whether it was just the cell phone information that led them to change their reason from that she's being held hostage to this is a homicide investigation, we don't know. They haven't spoken about that. But that change is stark within the warrant.
So by October 2018, now the FBI is involved and the DeFrance property is searched with FBI cadaver dogs. Now, there were some logistical, financial issues that prevented this search from being complete until October, and that was 4 months after Jermain's disappearance. The good thing is cadaver dogs are pretty good. I think even after 4 months, if there was a body there or had been a body there, they're pretty good at finding them. The property was searched for 2 days. Blood was found on 2 items. These items were sent to the crime lab to determine if the blood was Jermain's. Unfortunately, the results were inconclusive. So that's the last sort of significant event in the investigation into Jermain's disappearance. The case has sort of hit a dead end, but it's not the last interaction with Michael DeFrance and the police. On July 28th, 2021, he was indicted for possession of firearms. He had been convicted in 2013, as we said earlier, of a violent crime when he assaulted Jermain. That was when she was 17. You may remember that. Because of that, under federal law, he is not allowed to have a firearm. He had 4 of them. So he was indicted for that. He pled not guilty, as everyone always does. He was released under strict conditions. He attempted to challenge this. This is actually, there's been a lot of challenges to this particular federal statute. So he launched some constitutional challenges here. And it was reported on the Stolen podcast that the 2 dates that Michael was said to possess firearms were the dates of the searches of the property. So basically, they searched the property. They didn't find Jermain, but they found firearms, and he can't have firearms.
So this is all getting tied together, right? Basically, they searched his property, found the firearms, found him in possession, and they're tying this back to the domestic abuse charge against Jermain about 8 years earlier. These cases take a very long time. Nearly 2 years later, on April 27, 2023, DeFrance was found guilty on 4 firearm violations, including being a prohibited person in possession of a firearm and 3 counts of false statements during a firearms transaction. That's pretty typical. What that basically means is he was a person who was not allowed to have guns. He lied about being able to possess guns because when you fill out the forms to buy a firearm, you have to say, are you a convicted felon? And he likely said, I am not, but he really was. That's why you have the false statements in connection with the firearm transaction. So though these charges are not directly related to Jermain's case, the nature of Jermain and Michael's relationship was obviously central to this trial and these charges. The basis of the defense's argument was that DeFrance should have never been charged with PFMA as his and Jermain's relationship didn't reach the legal definition of spouse, right? Because they were not spouses or in a situation similar to that of spouses. I call BS. They were living together. They were in a romantic relationship. At this point, they had not had a child yet, but if you wanted proof of a romantic relationship, in the following 2 years, they had 2 children. So the defense was saying it was a technicality, right? They're arguing that that first conviction was not valid, and you need that first conviction to have the secondary conviction, because the secondary conviction completely relies on the fact that you're a felon in possession of a firearm. If you're not a felon, you're a person who can have a firearm. And so they're saying that first conviction never should have been charged with it because Jermain was not his wife. They were not legally married. They were not under the definition of a family member. Obviously, that statute is supposed to capture domestic relationships. And in this instance, the defense, it's a creative argument, I will say. It's a little bit of a step too far, I would say. I'm not sure I could make that argument if I were defense counsel there. But it did not win the day. But because central to this trial was that particular relationship, because they're contesting that the relationship falls under the category of this domestic violence statute, they discuss Jermain and Michael's relationship in depth, including the 2013 assault. And it's devastating. It's clear that their lives are intertwined and that they are, in fact, in a romantic relationship. Now, even though DeFrance was convicted of all 4 firearm violations and he was looking at 10 years in prison for these convictions, he received just 21 months in prison.
Which is embarrassing. That judge should be embarrassed. The prosecutors were obviously asking for more than that. He should have gotten more than that. There are so many reasons he should have gotten more than that. But the judges have the discretion at the end of the day, and he got, what is that, 1 year and 9 months. So that's the justice system for you sometimes. And it's unfortunate. He's going to spend a little time in prison, but not a whole lot of time in prison.
And remember, he hasn't spent really any time in prison. He spent, 1 day in prison for that domestic violence assault. And the other ones all got dismissed. So in some ways, when you see these types of charges, it's not about the gun. Right. It's not about him possessing a gun at all. It's about everything that preceded it. This is essentially Jermain's trial that she never got to have.
Yeah, and one of the things that good judges will often take into account is the fact that you've done all these things in the past and never been punished for them. You spent a day in jail after you did all this stuff. You know, you were never charged for throwing her out of a car. We talked about this some in a recent legal briefs, that judges can consider that kind of stuff. Well, they don't just have to consider what you're convicted of. They can consider everything. And this should have been a case where, I mean, the thing is, felon in possession of a firearm is he's not a felon, but in this case, prohibited person. You can get 10 years for it. You can get 15 years for it now. And judges are supposed to determine when should you get closer to 10 versus closer to probation. This guy should have got a lot more. He should have got a lot more. And it's unfortunate that he did not. I don't know if some of these arguments in trial, even though the state or the government won those arguments, if the judge took that into account at sentencing and thought, well, it was close. It was close that he should even be convicted, so I'm not going to give as much time. But it is what it is. So that's how long he'll be in prison, about-ish. You know, there's interesting sort of little legal things that we've mentioned throughout, the different sealing of the indictments, the challenges that Michael attempted to raise. You know, one challenge he attempted to raise, which I see all the time, is it was actually legal for him to possess a firearm in Montana, but it was not legal for him to possess a firearm under federal law. And you will often see defendants try and use that as a reason. But unfortunately, the Constitution is supreme. Federal law is supreme. So if it's illegal for you to do it federally, you won't go to state prison, but you can still go to federal prison. So that's where he's at. And the good news is he's now been convicted of this. So he is a felon going forward. And hopefully if he's ever caught with a firearm again, they'll give him a little bit more time. Okay, so that's the case. That's the evidence. It's not a lot. I know you're hoping for more. It's one of the reasons we wanted to do this. But now we're going to move into theories. As I said earlier, there is a detective, Guy Baker. He is a detective for the city of Missoula. He is passionate about this case. He wants to solve this case. He's been working on this case since 2018. And he says, he will tell you this is not a cold case. I'm working it. Want to get to the bottom of this. And he's essentially said there are 3 theories of what he thinks could have happened. And we are going to talk about those theories. I'll just go ahead and say one theory that no one thinks happened is that she left voluntarily. I know that's always something that comes up. Maybe she decided to go off and start her new life. No one thinks she ever would have left her kids. As you heard from her Facebook post, that was not something she was willing to do.
And, you know, we now have her financial records. There was no mass amounts of cash being withdrawn in anticipation of running away. There were no bags packed. She was in constant communication with her new boyfriend that night, you know. She was in constant communication with her family members who heard from her earlier that night. She was about to start a new training program, I think at the fire department that Monday. She had things she was looking forward to that she made plans to attend. And if she were to have disappeared, she didn't have the means along with her. She didn't have a car. She didn't have clothes other than what she was wearing. She didn't have credit cards or cash on her.
And, you know, like in so many of these cases, you mentioned that the firefighter thing. And she was starting that training. Her grandmother actually went on a trip and asked Jermain to go with her. And Jermain was like, oh, I'm starting this new training. And her grandmother was like, well, you know, you don't have to do it on Monday. You can come with me and you can do it a little bit later. But she was committed to it, and so she stayed. So obviously, like in so many of these cases, her grandmother now sort of thinks if she had just gone with me, things would have been different. So that's just an added level of tragedy for the case.
Okay, so the first theory, I think, is one that probably is obvious. Detective Baker's first theory is that the person who was last seen with Jermain is connected to her disappearance. That's not rocket science. If you're the last person seen with someone who disappears, you're going to be at the top of the suspect list until you're ruled out. We, of course, know the last person she was seen with was Michael DeFrance. He says it himself. Now, DeFrance seems to be the subject of a lot of investigation. As you can tell with all of these search warrants, he's charged with firearm violations stemming from the investigation. But there were other suspects who were investigated as well. Now, there are several reasons why DeFrance is a top suspect here, right? We'll kind of go through them really quickly here that you've already heard. Jermain and Michael had a tumultuous relationship with documented abuse, where law enforcement was called, not just by Jermain, but also by family members and third parties who witnessed what was going on. In fact, third parties, her aunt, tried to intervene on her behalf when things got so violent. We know that Michael was with Jermain on the night of her disappearance, was the last person to see her. Self-proclaimed said he was the last person to see her, dropped her off at her last known, quote-unquote, location. DeFrance's story about where he dropped off Jermain shifts, changes. That may not mean he's lying, could be bad memory, but whenever you have shifting stories on a key fact, the most important fact about a missing person, the last place they were seen, that will draw a lot of suspicion to you. So remember what those differing accounts were. He claims to have dropped Jermain off between 12 and 1 a.m., yet her phone pinged in the area of his home from the time of 2 to 10 a.m. And Michael explained this by saying that he broke her phone and then disposed of it. Also a strange story. Also, where are the broken pieces? Police have never found them. Family and friends of Jermain's claim that DeFrance really wanted to get back together with Jermain. Even one of Michael's ex-girlfriends claimed that he was obsessed with Jermain and cited that as the reason for their breakup. And shortly before Jermain disappeared, we know that she had started a brand new relationship. This could have angered DeFrance. If we're talking about motive, new relationship might be getting really serious. If she's even going to stay over at his apartment when he's not there, you can see the level of familiarity is one that Jermain clearly had with Michael at one point when they lived together, but no longer. And it is worth noting, though, that obviously Michael's been asked about this after the fact, and he claims now that he never wanted to get back together with Jermain. To date, Michael has not been charged with anything specifically related to Jermain's disappearance. But of course, we've talked about those 4 firearm violations that stem from the search warrant in Jermain's investigation.
So the second theory we have mentioned, human trafficking. So the police have looked into several trafficking theories, particularly early on in the investigation, and they did receive multiple tips that Jermain may have been a victim of human trafficking. But the police have not been able to find anything conclusively linking Jermain to any of these trafficking rings working in the area. Now look, they haven't been able to rule out the theory definitively either, and we know that human trafficking in Montana has boomed concurrently with the growth in the oil and gas industry that they've seen there. You have a lot of people, thousands of workers, who are coming to Montana, leaving their families behind if they have them. A lot of them are single. They're coming to temporarily work on these pipeline projects, on the oil and gas industry. They stay in these little boom towns that kind of pop up around wherever the pipelines are being built, and then they leave. And this has led to a massive increase in both violent crime, sexual assaults, and sex trafficking. And you've seen increases as great as 75% in some areas. Interstate 90, which many women are trafficked along, runs directly through Missoula, where Jermain went missing from. So look, it is not impossible that she was the victim of human trafficking. The one thing I'll say about this is she obviously had some vulnerabilities. She was not as vulnerable as someone you would typically see who is trafficked. She's not as young as a lot of trafficking victims. She doesn't appear to have any serious substance abuse problems, which can often lead to human trafficking. So I actually don't think she's a good candidate for it, but given everything else that's going on, I don't think you can rule it out.
Also, that's a really good point. Obviously, anyone can be the victim of sexual violence, but she also is not the personality profile that sex traffickers will typically go after. She's confident. She looks you in the eye. She's social. She talks to a lot of people. Honestly, oftentimes they prefer girls, young girls who are unsure of themselves, don't know where to turn to for help. And so they feel helpless, trapped in a hotel room, having to turn tricks to make their pimps money. And she, as we see from 2 hours of footage behind the Badlander, is very confident. She has plenty of friends that she can talk to. She knows where to turn to talk, right? That is unattractive to a sex trafficker. They do not want anyone who is going to talk, anyone who has ties to the community, because people will come looking for them. Again, does not rule out sex trafficking, but I would say her profile does not fit the typical, let's just pick this girl off of the street. So the third theory for Detective Baker was that he actually received a tip that a woman was killed on the reservation during a drug deal gone wrong. Unfortunately, this is also not uncommon. I very much believe that a woman was killed during a drug deal on the reservation, probably not just one woman, and there probably were multiple drug deals. He did investigate this lead, though, but he was not able to confirm that this particular tip and this event even occurred at all, never mind that it was Jermain. Additionally, early into the investigation, Detective Baker shared that there were non-residents on the reservation drug trafficking, but he interviewed these individuals and there was just nothing linking them to Jermain. It wasn't obvious that Jermain was a user, that she bought from them, that she was friendly with them, even knew them. So while there may be this illegal drug trafficking crime happening on the reservation, unfortunately, reservations are going to be ripe with crimes. There's just nothing tying Jermain to that particular criminal activity where she could be wrapped up into some sort of drug-related death, homicide, crime. Now, there were several other leads involving drug trafficking throughout the investigation, but no charges have been made related to Jermain's disappearance, and nothing has been found to link Jermain to drug trafficking in any way. I think it's really important that night, she spent most of her time outside of the bar, not even with a drink, right? When she walks away, it doesn't appear she's impaired. We don't know because there was no audio. We obviously don't have her body. We don't have any sort of a drug tox test. We don't know if she had anything in her system, but she wasn't reported by her family or friends as being someone who used drugs, who consorted with these drug trafficking organizations. Unfortunately, this is just a situation where we know these reservations have sex trafficking on them and have drug trafficking on them, but based on the information we know so far, there's been no links tied to those criminal activities with the disappearance of Jermain.
And look, is it possible that Jermain got out of Michael's car that night? Maybe they had an argument, so she got out quickly at the intersection, didn't make it all the way to the food farm. They had a little spat. She gets out of the car. He drives off in a huff. She leaves her phone in his car. He destroys the phone. Then, as she's walking, she just happens to run into some sort of predator, serial killer. Somebody just decides to take her and murder her. Is that possible? I mean, of course it's possible. That would be quite the coincidence, all that stuff coming together. But it's possible. I don't think it's likely. I think the most likely answer here is that Michael has something to do with what happened. And I think the fact that he not only had her phone, but it was in close proximity to his phone until 10 o'clock when it stops transmitting, when he destroyed it, I guess, or it turned off and then threw it away. Mysteriously, it's never been found. I think that is a huge red flag. Could you indict him? No. Is that enough? No. Is it enough to investigate him very seriously? Absolutely. But we have to have something else. And I believe there's somebody out there who has some information. There's somebody he's talked to about this. There's somebody who saw something. There's somebody who knows something, and that person needs to come forward. This case can and should be solved. There's no way that we should still be wondering what happened to this woman 6 years after she disappeared. This case should be solved, and it will be solved if whoever knows the right information will come forward to the police.
And here's the thing. Likely someone does know something, because where did the two phones ping? Near his house. He didn't live by himself. He lived with other people, family members, and he lived in close proximity to people that the two of them had grown up with. Close friends, close neighbors, people who were intertwined in their lives. Now it's the middle of the night, somewhere between 2 and 10 a.m. But when that phone stops pinging at 10 a.m., I think it's over at that point. That's an afterthought. Something bad happened before that point. Now we're just disposing of evidence. But if you heard or saw anything between the hours of 12 and 10 a.m. that morning, come forward. You may think it's insignificant that you saw car lights turn on, but it could be the very thing in the timeline that breaks things. And clearly, Jermain is not there. She's somewhere. Someone knows something. We've talked about digging holes. Takes a lot of strength to dig a grave or to dump a body. If that's what's happened, someone probably knows something. And I know we're speaking about this in very morbid terms. We're assuming that Jermain is gone, but I think very likely, looking at the timeline and looking at the history of their relationship, Jermain was gone by that morning. And I wish that were not the case. You know, there's this devastating interview with her grandmother, who she's very close to. And she says, I pray that she was sex trafficked because it means she's still alive and I can find her. And those are like the two hells her family is having to live in. So I fully believe someone knows something and they're protecting someone. But what's done has been done. And Jermain deserves justice, and her family deserves answers, and her sons deserve answers. They were just 2.5 and 4 when she disappeared. They barely knew their mom, a mom who may have given her life for them. And they deserve answers just as well. And the devastating thing about this story is this is but one of too many stories. And if you're in this situation, but you're a couple years ahead, you've had the situation where someone you love or you think loves you regularly breaks things like your phone, regularly grabs you by the neck. They've never strangled me, but when they get mad, they grab me by the throat because I wasn't listening. It's not okay. It is not okay. And these situations are really difficult to disentangle yourself from, especially when children are involved. Take your kids. Get out of there. There will be people there to help. There will be resources, there will be money, there will be shelter for you. You do not have to stay behind, because if it's not you next, it could be your kids. And the more we talk about this, I think the more that message can really get through to your loved ones. Because I think oftentimes we'll whisper and be like, wow, that looks like a bad relationship. Somebody should say something. Maybe you should be the person to say something. It may ruin that relationship for the time being, but you may be saving that person's life, maybe their kids' lives, maybe something more. So thank you guys for giving us the opportunity to talk about Jermain's case. It's deeply unsatisfying to end with no answers right now, but I also think that answers are just beyond our grasp. They are not far at all.
Yeah, we talk about disappearances, but it's sort of a misnomer because no one disappears. She's somewhere. She's out there somewhere. And I think, as we've said, somebody does know something. And I would hope, if not for her kids, you need to say something. Well, that's the end of this case. I know this has been a heavy one. They often are. And it's just a reminder of the struggles that a lot of people are going through out there. And we know some of you who are listening are those people. We hope that something we've said today is at least giving you a little comfort or help. Obviously, reach out to us if you have any questions, thoughts, if you need advice, whatever. If you just need somebody to talk to, we're always happy to talk to you guys.
I will Venmo you Uber money.
There you go.
To get out of there.
There you go. We'll be there for you in any way we can be, and we want to hear from you. If you have thoughts about the case, if you have any information, reach out to the Missoula City Police. But if you want to reach out to us, that works too. We'll make sure it gets to the right people. prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your social media. Enjoy talking to you guys. Join the gallery. Thank you to all of you who've told your friends. You know, we hear all the time that people found this podcast because a friend said something to them. They started listening and they fell in love with it. I hope every one of you will go out and tell a friend this week about the prosecutors. Just think, if everybody told a friend, got a friend to listen, all of a sudden we'd have twice as many listeners. And that'd be cool. So go and do that. Thank you to everyone on Patreon who supports the podcast and those of you who joined us tonight for this difficult case. Always good to have you guys along for the ride. Alice, this has been a heavy one. Do you want to do a question? Trying to end on a happier note?
That was a tough one.
That was a tough
one.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do a question.
Okay, let's see. Muffin Man wants to know if we would consider doing a CLE presentation at their annual conference. Sure.
Is the conference in Hawaii? Yeah. Yeah, no, you should email us. We've done many CLEs before, actually. You may not believe this, but we like talking.
We do like talking. So, yeah, we absolutely would do a CLE.
Yeah, you should email us about it. We've definitely done it before.
Yeah, we have fun doing that kind of stuff. So that would be, Muffin Man. You just let us know. The Muffin Man.
For those of you who don't know what CLE is, it's continuing legal education. We all have to take so many hours to keep being lawyers every year.
Jonah wants to know, what did you talk about with my other favorite prosecutor, Creighton Waters, at CrimeCon? I would love to have been a part of that conversation. I asked him if I could take a picture, thanked him, and then slinked away because he's so intimidating. I mean, he's a very nice guy.
But I can't believe Brett ran away. So I saw him in a different thing. I just assumed you all had a great conversation because it was like bourbon night.
Well, it was kind of late, so we could have. For all I know. Maybe we did.
It was pretty late. Maybe y'all did. You're right, because I went to bed at that point. So maybe y'all had like bonding karaoke night and you just don't remember. But I saw him and I totally fangirled. Literally, I was like, I just want you to know I'm also a prosecutor. So this is like only slightly creepy. But I watched your entire trial and I thought you did an excellent job. And I literally just told him, like, from one prosecutor to another, I was like, you faced some really intense struggles in that trial. And thanks for being a great representative for prosecutors. And he's like, thanks. Who are you? And I was like, I'm a prosecutor.
I'm a prosecutor too. Let's see.
But he was incredibly nice.
Okay. Well, we finished the case today.
Do we need to sign
weighty
off?
One. We do, and we're about to. Obviously, we'll be back with a new case next week. Frankly, not really sure which one it'll be, but we will have one. So, until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors.
And have you seen that? I don't know. It was like a reel on Instagram, TikTok, who knows where. But it's like how you deal with telephone scammers. And it was like, my credit card number is 3, 2, 1. And now we're live with the FBI tracking telephone scammer. Sir, can you repeat your name? And I laughed so hard because I've totally done that before.
Well, I always like it when they say they claim to be some federal agency.
I know, and I'm like, oh, they did that all the time at our office.
Well.
And we'd be like, is that right? Well, that's so funny because I'm literally sitting next to an FBI agent right now. Can you read me your badge number? And they're like, click.
Yeah.
You know, of all the things, don't they know that federal crimes, like that federal hook can get you anywhere? Say you're a state agent.